It likely can't have escaped your notice if you've been looking at anything Elite Dangerous related on the interwebs in the last week that, after a very heavy hint indeed, at PitCon in Nottingham on Saturday the 26th of April, the Panther Clipper Mk2 was finally officially announced on the Frontier Unlocked Livestream the following Wednesday as the next ship coming to Elite Dangerous alongside the Vanguard's update in the summer. Elite as a franchise has been around so long that for many of the now mature players of Elite Dangerous, the Panther Clipper is the stuff of legends, they themselves having never actually experienced the ship in any of its previous guises. They know they want the ship, but they might not, yet at least, really know why it's held in such high regard by those of us that are creaky and grey enough now to have experienced it firsthand. If you are one such individual yourself, then, speaking as someone who played Frontier Elite 2 on the glorious and similarly legendary Commodore Amiga 500, I can attest to the value and well earned reputation that the vessel now has. During those halcyon days of yore, having struggled through the trials of trading across anarchic space and fought off, or more often not fought off, numerous pirating NPC vessels, I made it my singular stated goal in the game to buy and outfit a top of the line Panther Clipper and then take my righteous justice to those same anarchic frontier systems, wreaking a terrible and fiery revenge on those that would have stopped my inevitable rise. It's a fairly classic Elite cliche at this point, but with good reason. With many similar video game journeys since those pioneering days, whilst you may set yourself a free-form goal in a similar vein, due to innumerate balance or previously unseen game restrictions, achieving the goal never really quite manages to scratch that hard-fought itch once you finally got there. This was, however, very much not the case with my Panther Clipper experience. The colossal starship was every bit the pirate-shattering nemesis I had hoped it would be, and the journey to it, though long and hard fought, was every bit worth the destination when I got there. Bristling with devastating beam weaponry on every turret, the Clipper had a cargo capacity that would empty a starport and could practically atomise a ne'er-do-well if it managed to land a shot on them. The Elite Wiki has some impressive stats listed for the box-like vessel, most notably requiring a crew of 12 and a cargo capacity of just over 2,000 tonnes. When compared, visually at least, to the currently concept-only images and video that Frontier have released, the DNA of the original Panther is clear to see in the Mk2, even more so when you see the two side by side. They both feature an enclosed bridge and viewport set high above and back from the ship's nose, as opposed to the Lakon style of cockpit that is all glass and actually forms the nose of their ships, such as the T9. Both ships are, of course, absolutely huge. The Mk2 Panther is so large that there has been chatter suggesting that it might not even be able to fit through the mail slot of a standard starport. David Brabens himself, however, has tweeted to that very subject, stating quite specifically that it does just fit through the slot. The Mk1 Panther, away from its size, was very notable in its day, as its side-mounted engine nacelles would rotate downward to provide vertical thrust for the gigantic ship upon landing. And the images shared by Frontier also show the engines pivoted in a similar fashion, but they appear to be a much more complicated affair in the Mk2 as opposed to the Mk1. When in the flight configuration, the Mk2's engines front and rear are offset in the vertical axis so that the forward engines aren't just pouring their thrust into the front of the rearward engines, the rearward engines being set higher up than the forward ones. When the ship is in the landing configuration, both sets of engines are pivoted upward to about 45 degrees, whereas the Mk1 they would all pivot the full 90 degrees to fire entirely down. In order to achieve the rest of the needed pivoting to direct the ship's thrust completely into keeping it aloft during the descent into a gravity well, the final back quarter of the Mk2's 4 nacelle configuration then pivots a further 45 degrees, putting each engine nacelle into a sort of lazy L shape. However, that complex pivoting and rotating manoeuvre appears to be only part of the story. As I've mentioned, in their flight configuration, the aft engine cluster is set higher up on the ship's body than the forward engines, so that the thrust coming from them doesn't interfere with their own operation. The fore and aft engine clusters appear, however, to be identical in design, and yet when the ship is on the ground there seems to be little or no difference in the height that they are set off of the ground. Further, more of the high set supporting superstructure at the rear of the ship is visible than would be normal had the engines simply rotated in place. We can only see what we think is a large groove or runner diagonally seated between the rear engine nacelle and the body of the ship. These factors combined leave us to believe that the rear engine nacelles not only pivot downward as previously described, but they also slide down inside that supporting runner, bringing them level with the forward engines when landing, thereby ensuring that the thrust coming from all four engines can form four equal height pillars of thrust as it comes into land. If we're correct, then the ballet of moving parts should be quite a sight to see when the ship finally arrives in game. What is also interesting about the vessel, visually speaking, is what we can't easily see. Normally at this point in the cycle of a new ship release we'd be able to easily speculate when looking at the concept images where any hardpoints might be mounted. With what we have of the Panther so far, that is proving much harder to do. There are some suspicious looking panels on the aforementioned nacelles. There is also a centrally placed area on the ship's forward dorsal section that looks like it could house a hardpoint cover, but those are a lot less definite sightings than we're used to at this stage. The talk of hardpoints also brings me on to the subject of the ship's defensive capability. It was always the case in the previous in-game iterations of the vessel that, as you'd perhaps expect, its manoeuvrability is a limiting factor, and therefore makes more sense to rotate the weapon rather than the ship. Turreted weapons in Elite Dangerous are themselves, however, a limiting factor. To be brutally honest, they are, generally speaking, notoriously ineffective. However, there has never been a ship in Elite Dangerous before that had the sheer volume of available square footage to allow for a significantly large number of turreted units to all be hitting the same target at the same time. If we assume that's the case here, it's also worth noting that perhaps the new Mark II Panther could potentially sacrifice some of its copious interior space to a couple of ship-launched fighters to augment its own firepower potential. Whilst we don't yet have access to the ship's full internal specs, we do know that the bridge seats 4 commanders, including the pilot, so it makes sense that it's in a position to give those extra commanders something to do. Defense of the vessel, whilst in flight, would seem the obvious go-to. All of this conjecture makes a lot more sense as well taken in the context of the launch cycle that Frontier have chosen to place the Panther Clipper in, arriving as it does with the revamped and, we're guessing reimagined, squadron system known as Vanguards. One of the features of the Panther's exterior that leapt out at us here when we first saw it is what looks like modularity in the aft exterior spaces. It appears almost as though the Panther itself is the light grey U-shaped area and that the darker charcoal grey areas are cargo containers, almost like the trailer section of an articulated truck. I do think this is likely an implied functionality, however, and I'm not honestly expecting any changes in appearance or functionality over and above what you would normally expect from another ship in Elite Dangerous. I mentioned earlier in this piece that we were taking cues on the ship's function from what we can't see as much as what we can. When looking over all of the imagery that FDEV have supplied to us here, there is one feature that is particularly prominent by its absence, and that feature is the entranceway to the vessel. In all the other ships released over the last year, it's been immediately apparent at the concept stage where the entry and egress point for any given specific vessel is. Not so with the Mark II Panther Clipper, however. It certainly isn't explicitly detailed, and no matter where we look on the ship images we have, we can't see a strong enough hint even at a doorway or staircase, etc. It's not outside the realms of possibility that the Panther is one of the ships in Elite that just has a purely magical portalized entry point through a blue tube of despair, and it won't even have a pretend ramp or staircase like all the other recent new additions to the game that we can gaze upon with dreamy water filled eyes whilst we ponder on what could have been. The rearward surface of the vessel has a somewhat large closed ramp feel to it, along similar lines to a modern day large cargo plane, but there's just not enough visual evidence to point at it wistfully, or should that be wishfully, and say yes, I definitely think it's there, so I'm not going to, as cool as that would be. It perhaps goes without saying that I think the Panther Clipper will likely be a fine addition to the existing game. I don't anticipate it being the game winning behemoth that the Mark I was, simply because there are wider balance implications in the multiplayer environment that the Mark II finds itself in, and that's only right and fair. I do think it would be nice, however, if it presented a different challenge to any potential pirating vessel, whether they be a commander or not, particularly if it's fully multi-crewed. That scenario could be very, very interesting indeed. Frontier haven't said yet when the ship will be released into early access. Given the current established cadence of ship releases and where we are in that cycle, our best guess currently is likely mid to late June, but when we know more we will of course let you know right here. What features would you like to see in the Mark II Panther Clipper? Where do you think the entranceway is, and will you be buying one for yourself in early access? Let us know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the channel so that you see all our videos and community posts, and if you'd like to support our work here at the Burr Pit, you can also join us on Patreon. Links to that and everything else we've talked about in this video you'll find linked below. That's it for now. Thanks very much for watching. We very much look forward to seeing you next time.